We will decide for ourselves how we control immigration, and we will be free to pass our own laws.
Theresa May says she'll trigger Article 50 to start leaving the EU by March. Good evening. Theresa May has revealed her starting position. She wants British business to trade freely in Europe, but will not compromise on having control of immigration. So, unless the EU suddenly buckles and does a complete U-turn, we are almost certainly out of the single market. And it's all happening before the next election, because the two-year process of leaving will begin in March, when the Prime Minister triggers Article 50. There's no such thing, she says, as a choice between soft and hard Brexit. So tonight, does Brexit really mean hard Brexit? Also tonight, Hungary votes on whether to accept what Europe decides is its fair share of refugees. Will it be another slap in the face for Brussels? What could be the strongest hurricane in nearly 10 years is heading for the Caribbean. And in the football, the leaders lose at last. Manchester City's 100% record ends in a 2-0 defeat at Spurs. So Theresa May has used the start of the Conservative conference in Birmingham to reveal a little more of her strategy for taking Britain out of Europe. In her first conference speech as leader, she said the government would trigger Article 50 of the EU Constitution before the end of March to begin 2 years of negotiations. It will also publish what she called a Great Repeal Bill to remove EU control over British laws once the deal is done. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports from Birmingham.
Theresa May owes her place to the Leave victory she opposed, albeit half-heartedly. Her audience, the Tory activists, voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, and she arrived at her first conference as leader with a promise. Moving Article 50 of the treaties, the moment Britain formally applies to leave the EU, their longed-for moment wasn't far off.
Even now, some politicians, democratically elected politicians, say that the referendum isn't valid, that we need to have a second vote. Others say they don't like the result, and they'll challenge any attempt to leave the European Union through the courts. Come on. There will be no unnecessary delays in invoking Article 50. We will invoke it when we are ready, and we will be ready soon. We will invoke Article 50 no later than the end of March next year.
Promised a Great Repeal Act, which, when the negotiations are concluded and Britain leaves, would put all EU law into UK law so it can be repealed at will by Parliament. That wouldn't, she said, include employment protections. She mocked those who spoke of two options for Brexit.
There's no such thing as a choice between soft Brexit and hard Brexit. The line of argument in which soft Brexit amounts to some form of continued EU membership and hard Brexit is a conscious decision to reject trade with Europe is simply a false dichotomy.
But in her readiness to prioritise control over immigration, she sounded to many closer than ever to those branded hard Brexiteers.
I want it to involve free trade in goods and services. I want it to give British companies the maximum freedom to trade with and operate in the single market, and let European businesses do the same here. But let me be clear. We are not leaving the European Union today to give up control of immigration again.
Theresa May stole the top slot and the headlines from her pro-Brexit ministers, all speaking at the conference today as well, keen to own the policy that will define her premiership. Aides say she hopes this conference can talk about other issues this week. But she knows the Brexit talks will dominate this gathering and the years ahead.
And Gary joins us live now from outside the conference. Gary, this claim that there's no such thing as a choice between soft and hard Brexit is quite a claim. What will people make of it?
Well, most of the people I spoke to leaving the hall after Theresa May's speech, for all the respect they have for nonetheless were engaging in those very terms which she was rubbishing, and they thought she was at the hard Brexit end of the market. Until now, Theresa May has been very particular about making sure that virtually nothing was taken off the table. All the options were still there for her to play with. Great big blank sheet and lots of options all around it, and working out what would be written on the sheet. Today, I think, effectively, she wrote something on the sheet, and she wrote that we will not be full members of the single market. She didn't say it explicitly, but the implications of everything she said were there, and she obviously thought that this moment was significant enough to talk to her cabinet colleagues about it and get other people to talk to them about it just as recently as yesterday, just to clear that they were happy with what was going to be said here. It didn't go, she's very keen on process, it didn't go through cabinet itself, but there was a ring round and everybody was squared. Woe betide anybody who turned round and said you can't say it, of course.
How much choreography has there been around what was going on stage today?
Well, quite a bit, actually. We were told originally that the three Brexiteer ministers would turn up, Liam Fox, David Davis, Boris Johnson. They'd own the day, and then it became a day when actually Theresa May was going to turn up, and she effectively stole all the lines from them. A lot of people drifted out of the hall as David Davis came in. He was originally the star billing for the first day. She made sure that she had total ownership of the Brexit plan, and that anything that was going to be said that was important or new or interesting was going to come from her, and she did that. One other bit of choreography, they played a video at the beginning all about David Cameron. It stopped abruptly round about the time of the last general election. It's as if the first 6 months of this year and his downfall, which of course a lot of people here effectively prompted by backing Brexit, didn't really happen.
Thanks, Gary. Well, joining us now, also from Birmingham, is the senior Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin, who campaigned to leave the EU. Bernard Jenkin, so Theresa May says she'll trigger Article 50 in March and begin this 2-year process. You don't really think she needs to do even that, do you?
No, I think this is absolutely fine. I thought her speech was full of substance and pitch perfect. And I've longed for a Conservative leader to make that kind of speech for about 25 years. Not that I always advocated leaving the EU, but to talk about us controlling our own laws and controlling our own destiny and being an independent country. Ever since we started down the track of the Maastricht Treaty, and no Conservative Prime Minister or leader has been able to say all this, and it's the referendum that's released the Conservative Party from this past.
Yeah, all right, all very loyal, and you get your tick for that, but you've written a piece today in the newspapers saying Article 50 and the Article 50 process is something we could get bogged down in. What do you mean by that?
Yes. Well, Article 50 wasn't put in the Lisbon Treaty to make it easier to leave the EU. There was always an implied right for any state that wanted to leave the EU in the treaties. And by putting Article 50 in, they've laid down a process which, during the period, the 2-year period, takes away some of our voting rights and sets down a procedure that we can't talk to the other member states. We've got to negotiate with the Commission. And at the end of it, there's no guarantee of an agreement. It means you get to the end of the 2 years after you've been messed around, but maybe the European Union can't agree on what deal to offer the leaving state. We have to be prepared to leave possibly without any agreement at all under those circumstances. Otherwise, don't trigger Article 50. But clearly, the British people want to leave the European Union. They voted for that. The Prime Minister is committed to that. So let's go into this with our eyes open. Let's not trigger it until we're absolutely ready to do so. Let's see if we can make the Article 50 process shorter than 2 years.
Did you take from Theresa May's speech that she is really singing your tune now? I mean, it looks like it is going to be a hard break, and Britain isn't going to be in the single market at the end of this process.
I completely agreed with her. We made it clear during the referendum, the Leave campaign made it clear, that voting to leave the EU means voting to leave the single market. The single market is a whole regulatory structure under the Commission, the Parliament and the European Court of Justice. We do not want to be in that.
Okay.
That doesn't mean we don't have access. And there's no, incidentally, she's completely right. This argument about hard and soft Brexit is a narrative pursued by those who are still campaigning for us to remain in the EU.
Well, let me bring in one of your colleagues. Chris Philp is here in the studio, who was pro-Remain Conservative MP. Thanks for coming in. Now, this idea that there's no difference between hard and soft Brexit is presumably not one that you would go along with, because the whole idea of what you're trying to or hoping to negotiate is unfettered access to the single market, no tariffs. That's what you mean by soft, isn't it?
Well, I think what people who have Britain's interests at heart would want to see is access to the single market, unfettered free trade, as you say. And I think if we ended up leaving and going on to WTO terms, that would be very bad for business in this country, but it would also be very bad for business on the continent as well.
Why would it be bad? Just lay out, what would be the problem?
Well, for example, there would be tariffs on goods, product standards would suddenly be different, so exporting our goods into Europe and vice versa would suddenly become very hard. But of course, Europe has a trade surplus with us, so it would hurt them more than it hurts us. German cars would suddenly have a 9.3% tariff slapped on them. So it would damage the Europeans as well as us. But we need to guard against, particularly the European Commission, trying to punish the UK or make an example of us to deter others. So I think we need to be talking directly to other member states, particularly the Germans and the French, to make sure we do a deal which is in their interests as well as ours, so maintaining that vital free trade.
Bernard Jenkin, what about banks getting access to Europe and sort of the free movement of, or the free trade of services?
Well,
you think this is all going to be
UK
negotiated afterwards?
Well, our market for services is very open already, and we should be offering unilateral open passporting to European banks if they want it.
Yeah, no, it's about our banks being able to work in Europe, isn't it?
Yes,
that's the problem.
Yes, I know, but any substantial bank has already a footprint in many other member states. Many American and Japanese banks use their footprint in Luxembourg as their footprint for passporting around the EU.
Yes, but they'll leave London, won't they? They won't be headquartered here anymore.
No, they will not leave
And we
London.
won't get the tax revenue, and you'll be satisfied with sovereignty, but we will lose out as a result.
No, this is complete rubbish, and you should stop saying it, because
well, it's
London
what they're
is a financial centre.
If you talk to them, it's what they will tell you.
No, they won't actually quantify this. The fact is that London is an enormous global financial centre that's larger than the whole of the rest of the European Union put together. And the idea that all that's going to migrate to the European Union just because there isn't passporting. Passporting only came in a few years ago. It is not as nearly as significant as some people in the city, the Remainers, are trying to suggest.
Well, look, I think it is an issue. Bernard, I think it is an issue because
in any case, we should offer the European Union
just let Chris
to continue passporting in the hope that they will continue to do the same.
And bankers,
Chris, over to you.
That's very kind, Bernard. The bankers I've spoken to think that something like 10% of jobs in the city are dependent on the passport, and if we end up not maintaining the passport or something very similar to it, about 10% of jobs will go overseas. Now, it's not catastrophic, but it's damaging. So I hope we can find a way of making sure those 10% of jobs that might be at risk do stay in London.
Chris Philp,
well, I hope we can agree that we should do our best to keep those jobs in London, but I doubt it's as much as 10%.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll continue this conversation another time. Chris Philp, thank you for rushing in. I'm sorry, I know our car was a bit late, but thank you for coming in. Now, another country seeking to distance itself from EU requirements is Hungary. Its government is holding a referendum today to seek support for its opposition to mandatory refugee redistribution quotas across member states. The country is one of the biggest recipients of EU funds, but the Prime Minister is one of Brussels' biggest critics. The referendum won't be legally binding, but it could encourage other states to follow suit and put pressure on the EU to think again, as Jane Death reports.
Hungary's building a second border fence to double its defences against migrants trying to cross the country for Northern Europe. The law was changed to allow the army to use rubber bullets and tear gas to force people back. All this was popular with many Hungarians. Viktor Orban is Hungary's right-wing prime minister. He's called migration a poison. He's asking the country to say no to the small EU quota of 1,294 people. People he says he doesn't want to live with.
We are proud that we are the first, and unfortunately we are the only one up to now in the European Union who managed to have a referendum on the migrant issue. I would be happy to see other countries to follow, but anyway, I have some responsibility for the leadership of Hungary, not for the other countries of the European Union.
And here is the referendum question. Do you want the EU to be able to resettle non-Hungarians in Hungary without the approval of the National Assembly? And the answer, it seems, will be no.
I voted no because there are a lot of poor people in our country too, and if more poor people come in, we'll be even poorer and have to work even harder, and we can't support them.
I think every country have their own right to decide who to invite to their countries or who not.
The governing Fidesz party has run a Project Fear poster campaign, from Don't Take the Risk to Did you know the migrant crisis has seen harassment of women go up, and the Paris attacks were carried out by migrants. A year ago, 2/3 of Hungarians said they wanted to help refugees. Now only a third do, and they're being urged to boycott the vote.
We don't agree with the referendum. We think that this is a propaganda tool used by the government to increase xenophobia in Hungary and use the atmosphere of fear.
It is really astonishing, I would say, that they are investing, the Hungarian people's money into doing this for a referendum, by the way, which is not even legally binding, not here and not in Brussels.
Anti-EU nationalist sentiment is mild compared to some people's politics here. Jobbik is Hungary's third biggest party and calls itself radically patriotic. Critics call it anti-Semitic and say it's linked to militias who've harassed Roma villages. Viktor Orban doesn't want to leave the EU, but he does want a stick to beat it with. He wants a harder, less liberal Europe. And a no vote in this referendum would be one in the eye for Brussels, already bruised by Brexit.
Now in Syria, government forces have offered safe passage to rebel fighters to leave eastern Aleppo. Rebel-held areas of the city were again subjected to dozens of Russian airstrikes overnight, helping pro-government forces to advance in the north of the city. Today's statement from the Syrian army called on rebel forces to leave the area and let civilian residents live their normal lives. Haiti is bracing for its strongest Atlantic storm in almost a decade. The stormy weather could hit the Caribbean tonight, before hurricane winds sweep into Haiti and Jamaica's southern coast tomorrow, threatening the Jamaican capital, Kingston, and the island's only oil refinery. Matthew is then due to hit Cuba on Tuesday, potentially moving over the US base at Guantanamo. The storm could move on to the Bahamas and the east coast of the United States, although forecasting that far ahead is often difficult. Florida's governor said residents should prepare for the storm. Matthew could bring winds of up to 150 miles per hour and 40 inches of rain, making it the worst storm to affect the region since Hurricane Felix in 2007. In Jamaica, amid fears of landslides and floods, people have been stocking up on emergency supplies, and the Prime Minister has urged citizens to prepare their homes before it's too late. On to the sport, and it's a busy Sunday in the Premier League. In the midday match, Jose Mourinho's Manchester United faced strugglers Stoke City, who are yet to win in the league this season. In contrast, league leaders Manchester City, who travelled to White Hart Lane in the afternoon kick-off, have won all 6 of their matches so far. Kieran Moodley reports.
Buoyed by last week's 4-1 win against Leicester, Jose Mourinho kept the same starting 11 for the visit of a Stoke side rooted to the bottom of the table. But Mark Hughes' men were more resilient than their league position implied, and after an hour of United huffing and puffing, Mourinho brought on both Wayne Rooney and Anthony Martial to turn their fortunes around. And they did exactly that almost immediately.
And it's Martial again!
Yet that lead didn't last long, Joe Allen taking advantage of David De Gea's mistake to score the equaliser, securing Stoke's first league point at Old Trafford since 1980. Talking of history, Mauricio Pochettino's first game as a manager was against Pep Guardiola back in 2009. This time, unbeaten records were at stake, with both Spurs and Manchester City yet to be defeated in the league. With Tottenham pressing high early on, their fast start to the game resulted in Alexander Kolarov slicing the ball into his own net. And as City tried to get back into the game, a sublime pass from Son Heung-min allowed Dele Alli to score a second for Spurs. With City's 100% record beginning to slip away, Fernandinho's foul gifted Spurs a penalty and the opportunity to make it 3-0 in the second half.
Bravo dances on the line and saves.
Claudio Bravo saved from Eric Lamela, to leave City still with hope. But with Guardiola's men lacking that killer touch, Spurs triumphed at the Lane to move to just 1 point behind the league leaders.
In today's other games, Burnley are currently playing Arsenal. There's so far no score. Earlier, Leicester and Southampton drew 0-0. One of the biggest events in the racing world has been won by a horse called Found. The 6-1 shot was first past the post in a 1-2-3 for the Irish trainer Aidan O'Brien in the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The pre-race favourite, Postponed, finished 5th. There's a full-length replay of the Malaysian Grand Prix on Channel 4 straight after this programme. So if you don't want to know what happened, close your eyes, put your fingers in your ears, count to 50, jump up and down, do whatever you want. It turned out to be a dramatic race and one that could be very costly to Lewis Hamilton's hopes of winning the Formula One World Championship. Hamilton started from pole and quickly pulled away from the field. Victory and retaking the lead in the World Championship seemed inevitable. But then on lap 43, disaster. His engine failed. Red Bull's Daniel Ricciardo went on to win the race. Hamilton's main rival, teammate Nico Rosberg, was 3rd, which increases his lead in the Drivers' Championship to 23 points, with 5 races remaining. Now, could it be an explanation for why the US presidential candidate Donald Trump is refusing to publish his tax returns? The New York Times has acquired partial tax records from 1995, suggesting that Mr. Trump declared a $916 million loss on some of his businesses in that tax year. Under US tax law, such massive losses could be offset against personal taxes over an 18-year period, possibly enabling him to legally avoid paying any federal taxes throughout that period. Kamian Zerin reports.
The Republican presidential nominee is pretty fond of boasting about his business empire. A fresh-faced Donald Trump in one of his Atlantic City casinos. And how many applicants for the White House have their own airline? But in the early 90s, Trump was in trouble, repeatedly recording losses or filing for bankruptcy. And tax returns obtained by the New York Times show that back in '95, he claimed a deficit of nearly $1 billion, which they say he may have carried over to avoid paying a cent of federal tax for 18 years. Very American and completely legal. For Democrats, it changes little. A caricature who lives in luxury while exploiting those who work for him. A man who, in business as in politics, stops at nothing to win.
They showed he didn't pay any federal income tax. So
that makes
if me he's
smart.
Paid...
Smart, say Republicans, because who wouldn't avoid paying tax if they legally could? And it meant they could buy a bigger plane.
He took advantage of something that could save his enterprise, and he did something we admire in America. He came back. The art of the deal is all about that. He talks about it.
But when America talks about it, this presidential election is more farce than art.
He hasn't released his tax returns, which means he's either not that rich, wrong, not that charitable, wrong, or he's never paid taxes in his life.
Warmer. Trump is the only presidential candidate since Nixon to refuse to publish their tax returns. Has he really paid no federal tax? He won't say. But this morning promised to create jobs and bring back prosperity and use his intimate knowledge of America's complex tax laws to fix them. For taxes to Americans are like guns to Brits. They really don't like them. And maybe swing voters will instinctively side with the Donald.
They're coming over to our side. You watch. You watch.
President Trump, the one with the answers.
Trump has said, I've used the system. I know the system. I'm the guy who has to, has played the system legitimately for my business. And I know what the other people are going through. And I know how to straighten it out because I'm the one that's seen all the loopholes and what have you.
The bottom line, if he has paid no tax, middle America in search of greatness might not actually care.
Well, let's return now to the Conservative conference in Birmingham and join our political correspondent Michael Crick, who's just been listening to the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson's speech. What did he say?
Well, traditionally for 10 years now, Boris Johnson turns up at the Conservative conference and really has two roles, as a sort of court jester to the Conservative Party and as the alternative leader in waiting. Well, this was a rather different Boris Johnson, holding one of the great offices of state and making a much more serious, high-minded speech, I think, than I've ever heard him make at a Conservative Party conference. He argued that two events in the last 15 years had really hammered created a lack of self-confidence amongst liberal people in the West, arguing that the invasion of Iraq had done damage to liberal democracy, and that the financial crisis of a decade ago had done huge damage to free market capitalism. And because of what he said, that lack of self-confidence, the world was now a less sane, a more dangerous and a more worrying place. He accused the Russians of complicity in war crimes in Syria and of bombing, effectively aiding the bombing of hostages there. But on Europe, he argued that in all the 2 months that he'd been Foreign Secretary and all the meetings in the councils of Europe he'd had to attend, there'd been nothing that he'd heard that made him believe that Britain would be at all disadvantaged by our leaving the European Union.
Thanks, Michael. Our main news tonight, Theresa May has told the Conservative Party conference that she will trigger Article 50 to begin Britain's process of withdrawal from the EU by the end of March. In her first conference speech as Prime Minister, she said there was no need to choose between a soft and a hard Brexit. Britain would negotiate its own terms. And that's it. We're back tomorrow at 7. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.